Well, I'm not sure whether North Korea is to blame or the U.S. side is to blame.
But it's troubling that they have not followed through with some immediate steps.
It's incumbent upon the administration to tell North Korea precisely what is expected and in what order.
They've got to come to some kind of public statement soon and some kind of demonstrated actions. Otherwise, we're going to lose momentum.
Do you think that it's better to have a timeline on North Korea's complete denuclearization?
I think the most important thing is that the U.S. side establish priorities.
If we don't see substantive action by the North in good faith, then the exercises will resume.
They've got a really steep hill to climb here if they expect China and Russia.
From the Voice of America, this is Washington Talk.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for this week's edition of Washington Talk. This is Connie Kim. Today on Washington Talk, we're discussing the follow-up measures on North Korea's commitment to denuclearization. It's been more than 2 weeks since the U.S.-North Korea summit, where both parties pledged to hold follow-up meetings on the denuclearization of North Korea. Pyongyang has not responded quickly to those meetings. We take a look at the North's holdup in the process. To help us better understand this delay from North Korea, we're joined in the studio by Frank Januzzi, a former advisor to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and current president of the Mansfield Foundation, and David Maxwell, a retired U.S. Army Special Forces colonel with command assignments in Korea, among other countries. Maxwell is now a fellow at the Institute of the Korean American Studies. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the program.
Good morning, Connie.
Good morning.
Thank you. Now, I want to start with the silence in North Korea. They've been very silent on a follow-up meeting with Secretary Pompeo. What do you think is the holdup from North Korea?
Well, I'm not sure whether North Korea is to blame or the U.S. side is to blame, because on the U.S. side, it's not clear that there's a list of priorities in terms of exactly what the United States expects North Korea to do to begin to implement its commitment toward denuclearization. That kind of a detailed roadmap was never developed by the administration prior to the summit meeting. And I think they've been working feverishly over the last several weeks to try to develop their wish list about what North Korea needs to do and in what order. And until that list is presented to the North Koreans, I think the ball is really in the U.S. court. It's incumbent upon the administration to tell North Korea precisely what is expected and in what order.
Colonel Maxwell, do you think there are possibly some problems between the talks between North Korea and the United States on this?
Well, certainly, yes. I think both sides are trying to figure out the way ahead. I think, perhaps North Korea, achieved kind of catastrophic success at the summit. The legitimacy of Kim Jong-un and the suspension of exercises and various statements by the president, it may be that they have not figured out their strategy. In terms of actions to be taken, though, it's troubling that they have not followed through with some immediate steps. And so I think right now both sides are trying to figure out the way ahead, and they've got to come to some kind of public statement soon and some kind of demonstrated actions. Otherwise, we're going to lose momentum, and it will be really troubling.
Or do you think that the North is trying to delay the talks in order to get an upper hand in the negotiations?
Well, it could be, although I think, we know that there hasn't been a public timeline, but I think President Trump is driving the negotiations. And I think he's actually set a de facto timeline. I think that by announcing the suspension of the exercises, which surprised everyone, I think including Kim Jong-un, but that actually puts a timeline because really between now and August, in the middle of August, North Korea has to take some substantive steps to demonstrate good faith negotiations. President Trump said if they don't, we can reconvene the exercises. And so I think that's a de facto timeline, and perhaps that's something that Kim Jong-un was not was not ready for, and that may be contributing to the perceived delay.
I think David makes a good point. I mean, it's possible that Kim and Trump agreed to some steps in private that we are not even privy to at the moment. We know, for instance, about small things like the return of remains. I think this was a good faith gesture that the North will probably implement in the near future. But I'll be curious to see whether there are any concrete steps on denuclearization that the North implements between now and, say, September or October that may already have been agreed, but which we are not privy to.
Just to go back to the return of the remains of the U.S. servicemen who had fallen during the Korean War, we still haven't received them back yet. What do you make of this situation right now?
Well, I think it's very troubling, and I think this is a misunderstanding of American culture and society by the North. I have heard reports that they actually have more than 1,000 remains that are ready to be returned. We've heard 200. We know that we pre-positioned 100 coffins in Panmunjom, anticipating that. But in the past, they have used remains as a bargaining chip. And if they're going to be held hostage, which will be the perception the longer the delay happens, that is really going to turn American public opinion, which seems to be supportive of negotiations and supportive of the engagement. That will turn the American public away from any kind of concessions to be given to the North.
To me, the more interesting question is whether or not the North will allow U.S. soldiers back on the ground in North Korea to start searching for new sets of remains. Because there are thousands of remains missing, and the real value of this operation from the U.S. perspective is not only to recover the bodies, the bones of those left behind, but to get our forces on the ground inside North Korea working together with the Korean People's Army. That's where the real prize is.
And President Trump indicated that he's not going to rush into negotiations with North Korea. Why the sudden change? I mean, we've been hearing something very different from what the administration has been saying just a couple months ago.
Well, I think his latest comments about there's a lot cooking, but he doesn't want to rush it because if you take the turkey out of the stove too soon, it won't be good. So I think he is giving them a chance, though. I think that, as I said, the suspension of the exercise is a big concession, and so I think that he doesn't want to establish a public timeline because that might put too much pressure on the North. And again, I think Frank is exactly right. We don't know. There may have been some agreements that we are not privy to, and so those may be being worked out, and he is allowing that to happen with the large hammer hanging over that. If we don't see substantive action by the North in good faith, then the exercises will resume.
And Mr. Januzzi, do you think that it's better to have a timeline on North Korea's complete denuclearization? What is your take on this?
I think the most important thing is that the U.S. side establish priorities. And a timeline on some of those key priorities would be helpful to drive events forward. So, for instance, halting the production of fissile material at Yongbyon, returning inspectors to North Korea to verify the shutdown of the plutonium reactor, as well as to verify the suspension of the production of highly enriched uranium. These, to me, ought to be the top three priorities for the U.S. government. And it troubles me that there's zero timeline about when these critical objectives can be accomplished. More troubling still is the fact that North Korea continues to make improvements, apparently, to the infrastructure at Yongbyon. It continues to produce highly enriched uranium every day as we speak, even though they have pledged to completely denuclearize. So I'm troubled by the fact that these top priorities have not been articulated by the White House.
One other point, though, priority in addition to those three is declaration of its nuclear program. It must declare all of its nuclear capabilities, its facilities, its sites, and that must be part of the priorities because that's really where we have to begin. And so there needs to be a complete declaration of their nuclear capabilities up front, and then we can go from there.
And I want to quickly take a look at the movement from Congress. Senators introduced a legislation that requires the president to submit a report on discussions with North Korea every 30 days. Now, how do you interpret this attempt at congressional oversight?
Well, I used to work on that Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and I can tell you that a bill of this nature, which, by the way, is bipartisan, It enjoys the support of Senator Gardner of Colorado, who's the chairman of the East Asia Subcommittee of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, as well as Senator Menendez, the senior Democrat on the committee. This bipartisan legislation is a clear vote of no confidence in the administration's implementation of their diplomacy with North Korea. The Congress is asserting its role, oversight role. There's not a lot of teeth to it, because so far the administration does not need anything from the Congress to implement this agreement. They're not looking for money. They're not looking for funding and support for different initiatives. They're not looking for a ratification of a peace treaty. But nonetheless, this effort by the Senate, to me, is a most welcome assertion of congressional oversight responsibility and clearly a vote of no confidence.
But I'd certainly defer to Frank's expertise in Congress, but I'd interpret it one additional way. It's also a vote of no confidence in North Korea. And Congress and the American people know the past history of negotiations. Yes. And so I think that, I agree that, they're holding the administration to task, but I think North Korea should understand that this is a no confidence vote in terms of North Korea's negotiation past history.
Then quickly, before we move on, what do you think a good treaty with North Korea looks like?
Well, first,
and who signs it?
That's right. Well, I think a treaty should be between North and South. They were the belligerents. North Korea was the aggressor, clearly defined in the UN Security Council resolutions that called for the world to come to the defense of South Korea against northern aggression. So they're the two belligerents. I think that that's really where a peace treaty should come. We should remember the armistice was only a temporary suspension of hostilities and agreement between military commanders, not between governments. So the armistice, of course, will be superseded by a peace treaty, but I think it should be North and South. And then China and the U.S. Can provide security guarantees for the treaty, but I really think it has to be between North and South, which of course requires a change in both nations' constitutions, which would cause them to have to recognize the existence of each country and the territory as belonging to those countries.
Yeah, David's put his finger right on this thorny issue of who signs the treaty, and I think he's right as a matter of law and also as a matter of policy that the North and South should sign, and then of course the U.S. and China as the belligerent states must guarantee and must also essentially translate the armistice agreement into that formal peace treaty. But it's going to be tricky to get that done.
And there's a lot of complex issues with the United Nations. I don't think we've ever seen UN Security Council resolutions repealed. Now, of course, China's a member of the P5. It was not in 1950. And so resolutions 82, 83, 84, and 85, which govern the United Nations Command, govern the armistice, will all have to be dealt with in the Security Council.
Well, we'll have to see whether that good treaty with North Korea will come up or not. If we could change the focus of our discussion to China and Russia's impact on denuclearization. But following that summit, Beijing and Moscow have been quick to meet with Pyongyang. What will be the impact of China and Russia in these negotiations? Now, Defense Secretary James Mattis and National Security Advisor John Bolton flew to China and Russia following the summit. What do you think the two may have discussed on North Korea?
Well, they clearly want to get China and Russia to be supportive of this Trump initiative. What's unclear is whether or not they are also still pushing for the maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration. It's pretty clear to me that Beijing is eager to resume more normal economic relations with the North. The 3 visits by Kim Jong-un to Beijing suggest a rapidly improving China-North Korea relationship. So I think Mattis and Bolton, they've got to really steep hill to climb here if they expect China and Russia to try to maintain pressure on the North until the North takes concrete steps on denuclearization.
Secretary Mattis's visit to China came as U.S.-China tensions escalate in the trade front. Do you think we'll be seeing less cooperation from China on pressuring North Korea as the tensions continue between the two countries?
Well, I think there's certainly, this is a three-dimensional chessboard, with trade, North Korea, security, and all, competing for attention and decisions and action. I do think that maximum pressure is over. I think that China and Russia both want to maintain a stable North Korea, and reducing maximum pressure, I think from their view, is good for doing that. I think they're supportive of denuclearization, but they are more supportive of maintaining the status quo, and even in terms of Russia's case, perhaps undermining U.S. legitimacy and acting as a spoiler. I think everyone has been enthralled with the opportunity for investment, for making money. China, Russia, we hear railroad, oil pipelines, and of course all the Chinese businesses that have traditionally traded with North Korea. So I think everybody thinks that with the agreement, the summit in Singapore, it provides an opportunity for them to make money and to stabilize North Korea, which is clearly in China's and Russia's interests.
Connie, to your point about U.S.-China coordination, I was in Beijing this week, and the scholars and former diplomats with whom I spoke are all really quite worried about the deteriorating U.S.-China relationship. I think Beijing is becoming more and more skeptical of working closely with the United States in Northeast Asia, and the trade tension is contributing to that.
And there's been a long-standing rivalry between the United States and Russia. How do you think Russia's influence over North Korea's denuclearization affect the U.S. goals?
Well, the Russians can either help or hinder U.S. efforts. I agree with David that Russia wants to see denuclearization, but I think they really have their eye on the economic prize. They're looking to integrate the Russian Far East oil and gas assets into a Northeast Asia energy market, including South Korea, Japan, China. So I think Putin's got his eyes probably fixed on the prize of economic benefit.
Then quickly before we go, how do you think the U.S. should engage with China and Russia in the North's denuclearization issue? Do you think we'll be seeing more or less cooperation among these three countries?
Well, I think we have to try to gain their cooperation. We've got to maintain that relationship, but as I think we all agree, it's very complex with multiple issues economically and security and diplomatically. But I think we must try to get them to engage. We do have some strong leverage if we want to institute secondary sanctions on Chinese companies and banks doing business with the North. We have not played that card yet, but I think China should understand that we hold that card, and we may be forced to use it. So, but I think it would be in everybody's interest to cooperate on trying to denuclearize North Korea, and we should continue to strive for that cooperation until China and Russia prove themselves unable to come together on that.
The U.S. will definitely keeping an eye on how China and Russia move on the North Korea front. Before we go, let's take a look at the photo of the week on North Korea. Today we have a photo of a North Korean stamp marking the 2018 World Cup, even though North Korea failed to qualify. Any thoughts on this stamp?
Well, the only stamp I own from North Korea is one that they issued to celebrate the launch of the Taepodong missile. So when I see this, I'm just struck by the contrast between celebrating a sort of space launch and ICBM capability versus celebrating a peaceful competition in sport. So this is part of North Korea's transformation of their public image, and I'm sure they wish they were there, but I'm also sure they probably took some delight in South Korea's defeat of Germany in the World Cup.
Well, I was going to say that very thing. I said, this is typical North Korean propaganda, but had there really been greater detente between North and South, perhaps they would have put South Korea and Germany on this, and the winning score of South Korea defeating Germany, and all Koreans could celebrate that.
Well, we'll leave it here for now. Thank you, Mr. Januzzi, Colonel Maxwell, for joining us today. That's all for today's Washington Talk, and from all of us here at Voice of America, thank you for watching. This has been Connie Kim.